Tennessee has a landlord-friendly breaking lease framework with a statutory duty to mitigate that provides clarity for both landlords and tenants. The governing law is found in the Tennessee Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Tennessee Code Title 66, Chapter 28, which addresses the landlord's obligations when a tenant vacates early. If you're a landlord or tenant in Tennessee, the URLTA provides a workable framework, though the state's overall approach favors landlord rights more than most tenant-protective states. Let's start with the landlord's duty to mitigate damages. Under Tennessee Code Section 66-28-507, when a tenant abandons the property or breaks the lease, the landlord has a duty to make reasonable efforts to re-rent the unit. Tennessee's mitigation requirement is statutory, not just common law, which gives it clear enforceability and removes ambiguity about whether the duty exists. The landlord must make the same effort to re-rent the vacated unit that a reasonable landlord would make to fill any vacancy. Advertising, showing the property, and accepting a qualified applicant. The landlord cannot simply leave the unit empty and bill the departing tenant for the full remaining lease term. If the landlord successfully re-rents, the departing tenant's liability is limited to rent during the vacancy period plus reasonable re-rental costs, advertising expenses, cleaning, make-ready work, and any leasing fees. If the landlord fails to make reasonable efforts, the departing tenant can argue that damages should be reduced by the amount of rent the landlord could have collected through reasonable mitigation. Tennessee's statute also addresses what happens to the departing tenant's liability when the landlord re-rents at a different rate. If the replacement tenant pays the same or more than the departing tenant's liability ends when the new tenant moves in. If the replacement tenant pays less, the departing tenant may be liable for the difference through the end of the original lease term, though this is subject to the overall reasonableness of the landlord's efforts. Early termination clauses are generally enforceable in Tennessee. The state does not have a specific statute capping early termination fees, and Tennessee courts enforce reasonable contractual provisions. A clause requiring 30 to 60 days notice and a fee of 1 to 2 months' rent is typical and generally enforceable. The fee must represent a reasonable estimate of anticipated damages. A grossly excessive fee could be challenged as an unenforceable penalty under Tennessee contract law. Many Tennessee landlords use a two-tiered approach, offering a defined early termination option with a set fee and notice period, while also including a provision that holds the tenant liable for actual damages if they break the lease without using the early termination option. This structure gives tenants a clear path for a planned departure while protecting the landlord if a tenant simply abandons the property. Military members have the right to break a lease under the Federal Service Members' Civil Relief Act. Active duty service members with qualifying orders can terminate by providing written notice and a copy of the orders. The lease terminates 30 days after the next rent due date. No early termination fee or penalty applies. Tennessee's military population is significant, centered around Fort Campbell on the Tennessee-Kentucky border and the military installations in the Memphis and Knoxville areas. Fort Campbell, home of the 101st Airborne Division, generates enormous rental demand in the Clarksville area, and SCRA lease terminations are a constant part of the Clarksville rental market. The deployment cycle at Fort Campbell creates regular waves of lease breaks as units deploy and return. Landlords in Clarksville should have SCRA processing as a core competency. Arnold Air Force Base near Tullahoma generates some military rental demand in the Coffee County area. The Tennessee National Guard has facilities throughout the state. Tennessee has enacted protections for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault that allow early lease termination. Under Tennessee Code Section 66-28517, a tenant who is a victim of domestic abuse, sexual assault, or stalking can terminate the lease by providing written notice and documentation to the landlord. The qualifying documentation must include a copy of an order of protection or a police report documenting the domestic abuse, sexual assault, or stalking. The tenant must provide at least 30 days written notice before the termination date. When a domestic violence victim terminates under this provision, the tenant is responsible for rent through the termination date, but is not liable for rent for the remainder of the lease term. The landlord cannot charge an early termination fee. The security deposit is handled according to Tennessee's standard deposit return rules, returned within 30 days of the tenant vacating. Tennessee's provision also includes protections for the tenant's privacy. The landlord must keep the documentation confidential and cannot share the tenant's status as a victim with other parties. Tenants in Tennessee may break a lease if the landlord fails to maintain habitable conditions. Under Tennessee Code, Section 66-28-304, the landlord has a duty to comply with applicable building and housing codes, make necessary repairs, keep the premises in a fit and habitable condition, maintain common areas, and provide essential services including running water, hot water, heat, and electricity. If the landlord fails to maintain the property and the failure materially affects health and safety, the tenant can provide written notice under Section 66-28-502. The landlord then has 14 days to make repairs for non-emergency conditions. If the landlord fails to act within the 14-day period, the tenant may terminate the lease by providing written notice of termination. For emergency conditions that pose an imminent threat to health or safety, the timeline is shorter. The tenant should provide notice and allow the landlord a reasonable, but shorter, period to respond before terminating. The tenant must follow the notice and cure process carefully. Providing written notice, allowing the 14-day repair period, and then providing a termination notice creates a documented record that supports the tenant's position. Simply vacating without following the statutory process weakens the tenant's claim and may result in liability for remaining rent. Tennessee also recognizes constructive eviction as grounds for lease termination. If the landlord's failure to maintain the property or affirmative actions like shutting off utilities or failing to address dangerous conditions makes the unit uninhabitable, the tenant can treat the lease as terminated. The tenant must actually vacate within a reasonable time. Tennessee has a specific statutory provision regarding criminal activity that's relevant to the breaking lease context. Under Section 66-28-517, landlords can pursue expedited eviction when criminal activity occurs on the premises. From the tenant's perspective, if criminal activity by a co-tenant or other person makes the property unsafe, the tenant may have grounds to argue that the living conditions have become untenable, supporting an early termination claim. This is particularly relevant in situations involving domestic violence where the perpetrator is a co-tenant. Tennessee's abandonment provisions are found in Section 66-28-405. If a tenant abandons the property, leaves without notice, removes belongings, and stops paying rent, the landlord can retake possession after a reasonable period. The landlord should document evidence of abandonment, unpaid rent, removed belongings, disconnected utilities, no response to contact attempts, before entering and re-renting. The departing tenant remains liable for damages subject to the landlord's mitigation duty. From a practical standpoint, Tennessee has one of the most dynamic rental markets in the Southeast, and the local market directly affects the financial consequences of breaking a lease. Nashville is the state's dominant market and one of the fastest-growing cities in the country. When a tenant breaks a lease in Nashville, the landlord can typically re-rent quickly, often within 2 to 4 weeks in desirable neighborhoods like the Gulch, East Nashville, Germantown, 12 South, and Sylvan Park. The massive influx of corporate relocators, healthcare workers, and entertainment industry professionals creates a deep pool of prospective tenants. During peak season, spring through fall, broken leases in Nashville often result in minimal financial exposure for the departing tenant. Nashville's explosive growth has been accompanied by significant new apartment construction, which has moderated rent growth in some submarkets. Landlords in newer apartment complexes may face more competition when re-renting after a lease break, compared to landlords of single-family homes or boutique properties in high-demand neighborhoods. Memphis has a different dynamic. The market is more affordable with more moderate demand. Re-rental times in Memphis vary significantly by neighborhood. Desirable areas like Midtown, Cooper Young, and Harbortown can be re-rented reasonably quickly, while other parts of the metro may take longer. Memphis has a higher proportion of tenants receiving housing assistance, and the applicant pool is different from Nashville's. Knoxville, home to the University of Tennessee, has a market influenced by the university, healthcare, and Oak Ridge. Student turnover creates seasonal patterns. Breaking a lease during the spring or summer allows for quick re-rental as students look for fall housing. Mid-year breaks take longer. Chattanooga has a growing market driven by technology, healthcare, and tourism. Re-rental is generally moderate, faster in revitalized downtown areas and slower in outlying neighborhoods. Clarksville, adjacent to Fort Campbell, has a heavily military-influenced market. SCRA lease terminations are a routine occurrence, and the regular rotation of military personnel means that landlords are constantly filling vacancies created by departing service members. The constant churn creates a market where broken leases are normal and expected. Landlords near Fort Campbell should price this turnover into their business model. Murfreesboro, home to Middle Tennessee State University, has a growing market with both student and family demand. Franklin, Hendersonville, and Mount Juliet in the Nashville suburbs have strong demand with quick re-rental times. One best practice for Tennessee landlords: include a clear early termination clause in your lease that defines the notice period, the fee, and the process. Tennessee's URLTA framework supports reasonable early termination provisions, and having a defined path prevents disputes. Consider offering a two-tiered approach: a buyout option with a specific fee for a planned departure and a standard damages provision for unplanned abandonment. This gives responsible tenants an incentive to communicate and cooperate rather than simply disappearing. Another best practice: begin re-rental efforts immediately when a tenant provides notice or when you discover a unit has been abandoned. Tennessee's statutory mitigation duty under Section 66-28-507 means you must act promptly. Document your efforts: listing dates, advertising channels, inquiries, showings, and when you accepted a replacement tenant. In a strong market like Nashville, you should be able to demonstrate quick turnaround. In a softer market, your documentation proves you made reasonable efforts. A third best practice: for Clarksville landlords near Fort Campbell, build SCRA lease terminations into your annual business projections. If 20% of your tenants are military and average assignment lengths are 2 to 3 years, you can predict approximately how many SCRA terminations you'll process each year. Planning for this turnover: maintaining efficient make-ready processes, having a continuous marketing pipeline, and processing SCRA terminations quickly keeps your vacancy periods short and your operations efficient. Tennessee limits the security deposit to the equivalent of 1 month's rent under the URLTA. The deposit must be returned within 30 days of the tenant vacating, or within 10 days if the landlord doesn't intend to make any deductions. The landlord must provide an itemized list of deductions. Failure to comply can result in liability for the entire deposit plus penalties. These rules apply whether the departure is a normal move-out or a broken lease. The timeline begins when the tenant vacates and returns possession. For the complete guide to Tennessee breaking lease laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our Breaking Lease Law series.